The Sichos, Chelik, Yud Zayin, Volume 17, the first Sich on Parshas Likkutei, page 313. In Aschalas Parshaseinu, at the beginning of our Parsha, is Rashi Maitik from Pasuk. Rashi quotes the words from the verse, Im Likkutei telechu, literally translates, you shall go in my statutes, or follow my statutes, and is mefarish. And Rashi explains, Yochel ze kiyum mitzvos. One would think that this refers to observing God's commandments. However, the second sentence of this verse is that you shall observe my mitzvahs, my commandments. So that is referring to the observance of mitzvahs. So what does im b'chukoisai telechu and you shall go in my statutes mean? That you shall toil in study of Torah. That's Rashi's comment on the first verse in this week in Parshas Likkutei. The mocker from them Pirush Rashi is Teras Kohanim. Rashi's source, as with many of his comments on the book of Vayikra, is in the Medrash called Teras Kohanim. Aber vibald as Rashi b'Pirushay was is al derech hapshat prutish mikra. However, Rashi's general style is that his commentary is based on the pshat, the literal or the simple meaning of the verses. Bring from Drashas Razal nor dort was is da ahechrech deruf in prutan shel ksuvim. The only time Rashi quotes a medrash in his commentary on the verse is if it is necessary, if this medrash's interpretation is necessary in order to understand the simple meaning of the verse, as the Rabbi has discussed many times. Muzman sagen, as ad der pirish and teres koine, as Rashi bring da, therefore we must assume that when Rashi quotes teres koinim, the medrash's interpretation on this verse is muchrach in pashtus avanas akasav. It is necessary in order for us to properly understand the simple and the most basic meaning of this verse. Der mit is euch muvan, for was Rashi darf da bringen die ganze Arichos, and that will also explain why Rashi elaborates and goes on in great detail. Yochel zakim mitzvahs kshuomer. You would have thought that it refers to the observance of mitzvahs, but then he says that you shall observe my commandments. So we know that that's referring to mitzvahs and so on. And and he does not suffice with a very simple, basic statement that when the Torah says it refers to toiling in Torah. Why did he need this whole introduction? Had Rashi not prefaced with this, that we would have thought that Likkutei telechu refers to observing mitzvahs, we would have thought that the interpretation that he does give, that Likkutei telechu means toiling in Torah, is the actual simple interpretation of the words. That is not the case. Because when the Torah uses the word Likkutei, it almost always refers to mitzvahs. So we can't say that that is the actual simple meaning of the verse, and that's why Rashi needs to preface by saying that you would have thought the erste svara is as this main kima mitzvahs, that it refers to observing mitzvahs, which is the typical interpretation of the word Likkutei. However, because observing mitzvahs is already referenced later on in the same verse, is from them that Rashi therefore says that we must say that the earlier statement in the verse cannot refer to observing mitzvahs, but rather toiling in a Torah study. However, the Rebbe will now ask 4 questions. Rashi bavarnt as da is b'chukoisei nit mitzvahs nor Torah. Here Rashi says that the word b'chukoisei does not refer to mitzvahs but rather to Torah. Gedaft meitig sein von pasuk im b'chukoisei. When he quoted the words of the verse on which his commentary is based, he should have just quoted the words in b'chukoisei and then said, we would have thought that this refers to mitzvahs, but because later on in the verse it actually mentions mitzvahs, so that's already covered. Nitmer, that's all he had to say. He didn't have to go into the entire whole detail that it refers to amelim b'Torah, to toil in Torah study and so on. Beis, the kasha wird noch stärker. Second of all, this question is now intensified. In Teres Koinim, Makar Pirush Rashi, as we said, the Rashi source isn't in the Medrash Teres Koinim. Shtei take yochelela mitzvahs. The language over there is indeed very, very concise. We would have thought that it refers to the performance of mitzvahs, or we would have thought that it refers to mitzvahs. When Rashi is Meshane, but Rashi changes the language. He alters it and he says, Unschreibt the kiyum mitzvahs, that it refers to the observance of mitzvahs. Teres Koinim says that it refers only to mitzvahs. In Likkutei, if he's interpreting the word Likkutei, he should have just said mitzvahs, commandments, rather than the observance of mitzvahs, which is an extra word and is not found in the source in Teres Koinim. Gimel number 3. Muslim sagen, as Rashi bavarent euch a zweite Sach. In kiyum mitzvahs am meilen batera. So Rashi is obviously over here discussing an additional aspect, and that is the aspect within the observance of mitzvahs to toil in Torah study. Davon verstehen, from the words, and you shall observe my commandments, hat man bloß die Reihe as b'chokoisei meint nit mitzvahs. All that tells us is that the earlier statement in the pasuk, b'chokoisei, is not referring to mitzvahs, nor Torah. It's referring to Torah. How does Rashi know that this refers to toil in Torah? Why not just regular Torah study? Once we've established that it cannot be referring to mitzvahs at the beginning of the verse because it already refers to mitzvahs at the end of the verse. So why does Rashi state that when it's talking about Torah at the beginning of the verse, it's not referring to general Torah study, but toil in Torah? And Dalet number 4. On the later part of the verse, Rashi explains, you shall toil in Torah, in order to observe and perpetuate the commandments. Well, the Chorda is instead das, was Rashi sagt früher. This seems to be in direct contradiction to Rashi's earlier statement, just a few lines above, that when the Torah says in the same verse, it's referring to the observance of mitzvahs. As that it's referring to the actual observance of mitzvahs, and not a detail within the general purpose of Torah study, as is that it should be with the intent to be able to observe Torah and mitzvahs. So Rashi says that the purpose of Torah study is in order to know how to observe the mitzvahs. But that seems to be in direct contradiction to what Rashi had just earlier said, that the first part is about Torah study, and the second part of the verse is about the observance of mitzvahs, the beer in them. So now we will explain. Talmud Torah is einer von den Tayag mitzvahs. Studying Torah is considered included in the 613 mitzvahs. It's one of the mitzvahs. It's a mitzvah to study Torah. Und mit dem Rechamisch soll Mikra weiß, dass von dem, was die Limit der Torah macht, was auf Limit der Torah macht, jeder früh morgen die Bracha, asher kitschanu b'mitzvahs. A child who's studying Torah now for the first time knows that Torah study is a mitzvah, because every morning, as part of his davening, part of his prayers in the morning and his morning blessings, he recites a blessing, thanking God for giving us this commandment, this mitzvah, to study Torah. That's why when the Torah says, it cannot be referring to mitzvahs, but it has to be specifically Torah study. But in Likkutei Torah is in klal von mitzvahs. Sorry. Therefore, we cannot say that when the Torah says it refers to plain a generic Torah study. But in Likkutei Torah is in klal von mitzvahs, because general and generic, plain, basic study of Torah is included in the 613 mitzvahs. So that brings us back to the original question, and that Rashi says, mitzvahs are already included in the statement that you shall observe my commandments. So what does in mean? And it can't be just regular Torah study, because that's included in the observance of mitzvahs. Therefore, Rashi concludes as that must mean nit limud Torah stam. There cannot be a generic Torah study, nor a prat noisef in limud Torah. It has to be an additional detail within the general concept of studying Torah. Was mikenit wissen von mitzvahs shmira, which cannot be learned out of the word you shall observe my commandments. Weil euch on dem prat is men mekayim the mitzvah von Talmud Torah, because without this additional detail that is not included in the original mitzvah, we still observe the mitzvah. You can study Torah you can observe and perform the mitzvah and fulfill the mitzvah of Torah study without this additional detail. Das Likkutei is the word telechu. That's why the Torah uses the word telechu. You shall go, you shall follow. Nitztam tishmiru, not that the generic you shall observe, mekayim zayin, which means you shall fulfill. Learn in Torah. It doesn't mean that you should just observe the mitzvah of Torah study, but rather you shall go in the path of Torah. It's different than just studying Torah generically. So now the Rashi wants to understand how you can increase or add a detail within Torah. And if you do not have this additional detail, you're not missing out on the actual observance of the mitzvah in Ki mitzvah Talmud Torah, the mitzvah of Torah study. So now if this additional detail relates to quantity, in zugeben Zman and Limud Torah, learning Torah for more time, it's still all part of the same observance of this mitzvah. The Zalber Tishmiru, when the Torah says observe, you're observing it. One person observes it for a little bit longer, another person observes it for a little less time. Similar to the mitzvah, the Torah says that you shall put on tefillin on your arm. See, this is a kurtzes man, there are lengers man. One person will wear his tefillin for a short amount of time, another person will wear his tefillin for a longer amount of time. He says, they're fulfilling the mitzvah in the same way. One person's doing it for a little bit longer, another person's doing it for a little shorter time, but the mitzvah is the same. So the same would be with regard to Torah study. Studying more Torah or less Torah for longer or longer time is not necessarily a bigger mitzvah. What does the words telechu, that you shall go or follow in my statutes, emphasize? It's tam tishmiru, not that you should just merely observe the mitzvah. Rather, you need to increase in quality. Your Torah study needs to have a qualitative increase. Amelim b'Torah, you shall toil in Torah. And that's not included in the general statement that you shall observe my mitzvahs. Because you can observe and you can fulfill the mitzvah in the most basic level without toil. Toiling is an additional detail that is not included in the initial mitzvah. But with this in mind, the order that the Torah makes these two statements seems to be problematic. Because, as we've just established, that when the Torah says you shall observe my commandments, it includes also the mitzvah of Torah study on its most basic level, lemigras, or surface study, as the Torah should have made that statement first, before saying that you shall toil in Torah. As they say, that's normally how a person studies Torah. First, you study the Torah on the surface, and only afterwards can you delve into it deeper and toil. Limud be'iyun. You don't start off your study by delving into the deepest parts of it, without first studying it on a simple, more surface level. So why does the Torah start off by saying first, which refers to toil, and only afterwards does the Torah say that you shall observe my mitzvahs, which includes in it the basic generic level of Torah study. Had we interpreted to mean generic Torah study, and then you shall observe my commandments, is my mitzvahs, that means that you're observing the mitzvahs. Then we would have understand why is written before because you need to have study in order to be able to observe. As is obvious, to wissen, was zu tun, und wie zu tun, darf man früher lernen. And in order to know what to do and how to do it, you obviously need to first study. So that would only make sense if B'chakoyse Telechu refers to generic study of Torah. Now that we've established that B'chakoyse Telechu has to mean an additional detail in Torah, toil in Torah, we cannot say that this is the reason that B'chakoyse Telechu was written first. We can't say that it is a condition, it is a prerequisite in order to be able to observe the mitzvahs. This amal Torah, this toil, cannot be a prerequisite to be able to observe mitzvahs, at least seemingly now. By leidas ha'maisa because in order to know that which should be done, is nit neitig der oifun alimud dafke von amal Torah. You don't need the toil of Torah in order to know what to do. After visiting din halacha l'maisa, in order to know practical halacha daily observance of mitzvahs, is maspik limud lemigris. Surface study is sufficient in the Sifrei Halacha, just general knowledge over an all-inclusive general knowledge of halacha and Torah is perfectly sufficient in order to know how to behave and to follow Torah and mitzvahs. Why do we need to preface that with amal Torah, with toil of Torah? Fun gufa is Rashi machriach as das is a prat in amelim Torah. This is how Rashi himself deduces that this is a detail within the toil of Torah study. As need blows the limit lemigras dav zaymet kavanah lishmer lakayim. Not only surface study is needed in order for us to be able to properly observe mitzvahs. Rashi's point over here is that in order to properly observe mitzvahs, you need to not only study Torah on the surface in a generic fashion, but you need to toil and delve into the deepest concepts of Torah in order to properly be able to observe Torah mitzvahs. And that's why Rashi cites a verse, you shall learn and you shall observe. As limudat Torah study, bli chiluk. All types of Torah study, on all levels, without differentiation, even the deepest toil in Torah, must be with the intent to eventually observe and perform mitzvahs. We don't toil in Torah just for the sake of toiling in Torah, but rather so that it leads us to properly observe mitzvahs. Let's move on. With this in mind, we now can understand. When Rashi says that you shall toil in Torah b'negeya to mitzvahs tishmeru, as a follow-up to the pasuk, to the verse saying that you shall observe my commandments, is to them as there's it's not a contradiction to his earlier statement that mitzvahs tishmeru refers to the observance of mitzvahs. While Rashi's pirush da is not of the Rashi's commentary over here is not on the words of you shall observe my commandments. Rather, his commentary over here is specifically on the words you shall go in my statutes, as we established that it refers to toil and Torah. First, Rashi explains what the words themselves mean. As a manage to you that you shall toil in Torah. Und noch, only afterwards, the tam for and now Rashi explains why they appear in the verse, why they were written before the words you shall observe my commandments. Because the entire purpose and the intent of your toil in Torah should be in order to properly observe the mitzvahs. And the Rabbi notes in one of the footnotes here that it's possible that really these two statements of Rashi should have been included in one comment, and the printer broke it up into two and probably should have not done that. However, there is still a detail that needs to be clarified. When Rashi says that we would have thought that the Mechukois Telechu refers to the performance of mitzvahs is muchach, that means as when Rashi makes that statement, he implies as that ordinarily, under normal circumstances, would have meant the observance of mitzvahs. However, because we are compelled to say that it refers to Torah because of the later statement in the verse that mitzvahs were already mentioned later in the verse, in the when the Torah says later on, you shall observe my commandments, muzmen lernen, as their pirush in B'chokos Telechu is a melam b'Torah. That's what compels us to say that B'chokos Telechu means that you shall toil in Torah. Is nit movan. So this is what we need to clarify. As is dach yadua, it is known as in mitzvahs ein da kama sugim. Mitzvahs are generally broken down into three categories: edus, chukim, and mishpatim. We'll explain in detail what all three of these are soon, but generally, Eidus is a testimony, Chukim is super rational mitzvahs, and Mishpatim are rational mitzvahs. Eidus represents mitzvahs that, Eidus are mitzvahs that represent certain events and occurrences. Chukim are mitzvahs that have no reason, and Mishpatim are mitzvahs that have a basic rational explanation. When their Sug Chukim is a mitzvah Chazayin Gzeiras HaMelach. So Chukim, a mitzvah that's called a Chok, is a decree. Earlier in Parshas Acharei, Rashi already discussed this type of mitzvah, which is a mitzvah that we have no rational explanation. We do it only because it's a decree from God. Therefore, because Rashi already told us what chukim means, now we have a question. Why does Rashi have to say that B'chukoisei refers to Torah? He could have very simply said B'chukoisei mean the mitzvahs in Sug von Chukim. That B'chukoisei over here is referring to mitzvahs that fall under the category of Chukim. These are super rational mitzvahs. In many places in Torah, Chukim is indeed interpreted to mean these super rational mitzvahs. And then when the verse continues and says, "You shall observe my commandments," that should refer to the mitzvahs that do have logical or rational explanations, mishpatim. So why does Rashi have to say that B'chukoisei refers to Torah? Why is he compelled to say that if he could very simply said that B'chukoisei refers to a specific category of mitzvahs, the chukim? The pashtus kemenent for him. So we can explain, perhaps on a very simple level, as eich mit dem Wort mitzvah says the pasuk oisen nor ein sug von mitzvahs mishpatim. As mit dem Wort mitzvah says the pasuk oisen nor ein sug von mitzvahs, had the Torah been referring to one category of mitzvahs with the word mitzvahs, mishpatim, if the Torah would have only said mitzvahs. And we would say that it only refers to mishpatim, the rational mitzvahs. The Torah would not have used the word mitzvah, say Hashem koila for all mitzvahs, because that's a general term that includes all mitzvahs. Nor the lashon mishpatei, the Torah would have used the language or the word, the phraseology mishpatei to imply specifically these, to indicate specifically these mitzvahs. As in pasuk, we have another verse earlier in our parsha that says these are the chukim, these are the mishpatim, and these are the Torahs. When the Torah indeed does want to list the various categories of mitzvahs, he does indeed refer to these types of mitzvahs as mishpatim. It doesn't use the generic term mitzvahs. And now the Torah does use the word mitzvahs. As it meant all mitzvahs, he must be referring to all the mitzvahs. So that's a simple answer, that because the Torah generally does refer to mishpatim in an instance where mishpatim are being singled out, over here too the Torah would have used mishpatim and not mitzvah had that been the intent. However, seemingly this is not a sufficient answer, but in a Friediken art, with the pasuk teilt vanander the mitzvahs, there is an earlier instance in the Torah where these categories are also listed, the various categories of mitzvahs, and this is with regards to Avraham Avinu. Avraham listened to my voice, he followed my commandments. He observed my commandments, my mitzvahs, my chukim, and my Torah. So over there the word mitzvahs is used. Rashi is dort mefarish. Rashi on that verse in Parshas told us, he says mitzvosai, when the Torah uses the word mitzvosai that Avraham observed, this refers to items, to mitzvahs that even if the Torah would have not commanded them, it would have been appropriate for them to have been commanded. But that's made mishpatim. That's obviously referring to mishpatim, to logical, rational mitzvahs. Then he says chukoisai. The chukos refer to dvarim sheyitzaharav. These are mitzvahs that the evil inclination and the nations of the world argue and debate us about, because there is no rational logic for them. And then v'sayirosai lahavi Torah shabal peh. When that verse, this is all part of Rashi's commentary on that verse, that when the Torah uses the word v'sayirosai, a plural Torah in the plural, lahavi Torah shebal peh, that includes also the oral Torah, as v'seroisei lashon Rabbi main Torah shebechsav, un Torah shebal peh, that Avram observed both Torah shebal peh, both Torah shebechsav, the written Torah, and Torah shebal peh, the oral Torah. And be that as it may, the word mitzvahs in that verse, obviously, especially according to Rashi's commentary, refers to mishpatim. Zet men dach von them, as I feel, when the pasuk sagt dem lashon mitzvah stam, when the Torah does use the word mitzvahs generically, since that's followed afterwards by the word chukim, the Torah now is referring to two categories of mitzvahs. In our instance over here in Parshas Likkutei, we could have said the same thing, that chukoisai refers to chukim, irrational or super irrational mitzvahs, and mitzvahs generically refers to mishpatim. Why did Rashi have to say that? It refers to Amelim B'Torah. Is there beer in them? So now the explanation. The word mitzvah is Meloshin Tzivui. The word mitzvah, in reference to commandment, comes from the root of the word tzivui. There's an tzivuim for the Meibishtin. They are instructions or commandments from God. Is move on. As der Nomen is Damatim Blois Benegates Mitzvahs von Nachmatim Torah. This word is only appropriate to be used for mitzvahs, for actual commandments that the Jews received after Matan Torah at Mount Sinai. That's when God instructed and commanded all these mitzvahs. Prior to that, it wouldn't be appropriate to refer to them as mitzvahs because they weren't yet commanded. Before God commanded and instructed all these mitzvahs at Matan Torah at Mount Sinai, is the Bamsug mitzvahs Velchem and Zakt Ashashama Avram, when we were talking about mitzvahs that Avram observed, there was no command, there was no instructions then. He did everything on his own. As der Lashon mitzvosai, therefore, when the Torah uses the word mitzvosai, we state by Avram Avinu with regards to Avram's observance of mitzvahs, far Matan Torah, which obviously occurred before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given to the Jewish people, and before these commandments were given. When the Torah uses the word mitzvahs, it cannot be referring to God's commandments. Because as we said, it was before these commandments were given. So what does mitzvah mean in reference to Avram's observance? The Riber Musman Dorten lernen as mitzvah meint in in reference to Avram, in the context of his time, mitzvahs means things that should have been or are appropriate to have been commanded. Rationally and logically, these are mitzvahs that should have been instructed. And the reason why they are referred to as mitzvahs, because your intellect, a person's rational logic, already dictates that these are things we should do. That's mishpatim. So before Matan Torah, any mitzvah that a person did because of his own logic and because of his own rationale was referred to as a mitzvah. However, now, in our discussion, when the Torah uses the word mitzvah, is v'shteit noch Matan Torah, and all this is occurring now after the Torah was given. Now that mitzvahs refers to all mitzvahs, including also chukim, all mitzvahs, edus, chukim, and mishpatim, all three categories are instructions, commandments that we have from God. Is der Rebbe schwer zu einteichen as der Mit is schödel b'chukoisei. We cannot say that when the Torah says mitzvahs, it does not include chukim. Was steht in selben pasuk, which is written in the same verse. And there are also commandments from Hashem. And when we say mitzvahs, it only refers to mishpatim. We can't say that. When the Torah says you shall observe my mitzvahs, if alle mitzvahs, that refers to all commandments. And therefore, we must say that when the Torah says it refers to the command to toil in Torah. Therefore, so this concludes now the basic explanation on Rashi, why he says that means amelim b'Torah. We can't say that it means chukim, because mitzvahs that's mentioned later in that same verse includes all mitzvahs, including chukim. We can't say that it means generic Torah study, because that's also included in the mitzvahs, because generic Torah study, basic Torah study, is is one of the 613 mitzvahs, and we also explained the order in Rashi why toil and Torah study is a prerequisite to the observance of mitzvahs, because all of Torah study, whether it's surface study or deeper delving into the words of Torah, are all required and are all part of the preparation to be able to properly perform mitzvahs. Now we will explain all of the above according to Chassidus. Hagam as Rashi's hechrech. Rashi was compelled to say, as that when the Torah says, "You shall follow my statutes," that refers to toil and Torah study. That was not because of the word b'chukoisai, not from weiter, rather from later on in the verse, as we just discussed. That later the verse says that you shall observe my mitzvahs, so that's referring to mitzvahs. So therefore, b'chukoisai telechu has to refer to something else. So although it's not specifically the word b'chukoisai that compels Rashi to say this, von deswegen darf man sagen, as der Inyan von Amelim b'Torah, nevertheless, we still have to say that the concept of toil and Torah study is mirumuz, is alluded to also in the phrase, "You shall follow or go in my statutes." Because Torah is an illuminator. Torah lights up our lives. Every element, every part of Torah is bright, and they illuminate everything around it. And this means obviously as Torah, especially the written Torah, is geschrieben geworden in an Eufen, as der Teuchen HaKosov soll sein lichtig. Was written, Torah, especially Torah Shebechsav, was written in a way that the intent and the content of every single verse is illuminating. It's bright. Meaning, nothing over here should be ambiguous. Everything has to be very clear and perfect. Therefore, if the word b'chukoisei would have no connection to the concept of Torah, nor of mitzvahs, and generally it only refers to mitzvahs, then instead of the word b'chukoisei, the Torah would have used the word b'teirasei or b'teirasei, singular or plural, as we said earlier. That would have been a lot clearer and more aligned with the intent over here that it refers to Torah. So why is the word b'chukoisei used rather than than another word that would very clearly indicate Torah? However, because Torah now did select this particular word, is mukhrach, we must say as dafkin dem lashon is mudgash dem inyan von amelim b'Torah. Now, within the phraseology, within this terminology used over here, b'chukoisei, we find the concept of toil in Torah. Now, in order to understand how this word b'chukoisei, when it is used in the context of Torah study, that it highlights the concept of toil in Torah. We first need to explain a detail within the title, chukim, when this word is used in reference to mitzvahs. So we mentioned earlier that there are three categories, edus, chukim, and mishpatim. This is yadua, it is well known, as chutz der nomen mitzvahs, aside for the general title, mitzvahs, which, as we said earlier, is a general word that's used for all mitzvahs. There are the three categories of mitzvahs, and each has its own name. Edus, mishpatim, and chukim. These are the three categories, and we'll explain now briefly what they mean. Edus, literally the word edus means testimony. Is there sug mitzvahs v'zakt edus av gewisse inyanim. It's a mitzvah that when we perform it, we are testifying on a certain event, whether it's avbrius shemayim v'aretz, the creation of heaven and earth, af yitzias Mitzrayim, or the exodus from Egypt, which is what Shabbos represents, or tefillin, as if Shabbos, tefillin, v'chadayim. These mitzvahs, we may not have come up with it on our own. They're not necessarily logical mitzvahs that we would have thought up and to observe on our own, but once they were commanded, they make sense because they represent and they commemorate certain events and occurrences. Mishpatim, now, the second category, Mishpatim, the mitzvahs was ilamala nit in the Torah. These are mitzvahs that had the Torah not been given, logic would have dictated that we would observe these mitzvahs anyway. And finally, the third category, Chukim has no logic, no rationale, and the only reason, the only source for observing these mitzvahs is because they were commanded to us by God. There's nothing logical about it. They're not mishpatim, and there's also no testimony. You can't point to a specific an irrational mitzvah and say that it represents or commemorates something. Or in Yanam is all they represent is a decree from above. Now in Lashon HaKodesh, the original Hebrew, the holy language, was is nit kein Lashon Heskemi. It's not a language of convenience or a trivial language. And in alle inyanim b'diyuk, every detail within this language is precise. Because these mitzvahs that have no rationale are named in this holy language. Chukim, this word chukah, their uptight from chakika also means engraving. In Chassidus, and the Alter Rebbe explains in Likkutei Torah in great detail the relationship between engraving and b'chukoisei. There is an actual relationship between the inyan von chukah between performing a commandment that is a super rational and the concept of engraving. More than just a similarity in the word, but also a relationship in the content of these two words. What does that mean? Der klales dicker Unterschied zwischen Malachas Chakika und Ksiva. Generally, the difference between writing and engraving is in them, was bei Chakika fordert sich mehr Koyach und Anstrengung wie bei Ksiva. Engraving requires more effort. You need to exert more effort. It takes more strength and more commitment to engrave something rather than writing it. Dibur, speech, is bloiza maisa zuta. It's considered an extremely minor action. Ksiva is shayna maisa shalom. Writing is a full action. Aber doch darf man bei Ksiva nicht haben so viel Koyach und Anstrengung wie bei Chakika. But nevertheless, writing does not require that much exertion in comparison to engraving. Der mitzvahs move on, was the mitzvahs was einem blois gzeres hamelach. Therefore, the mitzvahs that, as we said earlier, the only reason we observe them are because God commanded us to observe them. The term used to describe them are chukim, similar to chakika, similar to engraving. In order to properly observe something that has no logic, and sometimes it is the opposite of logic, is an avodah kasha. That's a great challenge. It's a lot more difficult and a lot more challenging than observing something that does have logic and rationale. Well, this also explains why the word bechukoisai is used. When we use that word in reference to Torah study, it's not referring to generic, basic study of Torah, nor amal Torah. It is referring to toil in Torah. When the word chukah is used, similar to engraving, it refers to a harder and a more exerting type of work, amal, toil. Now, once you start exerting effort and studying Torah and toiling in Torah, similar to the difficult or challenging work of engraving, in hearts, it engraves in the heart of the person learning Torah. As I feel of in libri keleva even, even if the person's heart might be as hard and as solid as a stone, which is typically where engraving takes place, on stones. If you choose to toil in Torah, wird sein versteinert Herz durchgekritzt und durchgerieben durch den Amal Torah. Your hardened and stone heart will become engraved and embossed through this toil of Torah. Avanim shachkum mayim, your stone heart will become worn out through water, as a famous story with Rabbi Akiva, that he saw a drop of a stone being affected by small drops of water. Every little drop accumulated, and eventually this rock became engraved, and a hole was bored into it. And similar, this heart of stone that a person who's toiling with Torah will eventually break through. In Torah, as we said earlier, every detail in Torah is exact and precise. Is vibald as amal Torah is lashon chakika, because, as we said now, that toil in Torah is referred to as chukah. There's which is the same term used to describe mitzvahs that are super rational. That itself indicates as their tam was amal Torah is chukah, that the reason the toil of Torah is referred to as chukah is not only because, as we said earlier, that it is a difficult type of work, nor also the toil of Torah studying also relates to an approach that is beyond or greater than logic. Not only because it's hard, but because what we accomplish is something greater than logic. When a person studies the oral Torah, you need to actually understand what you're studying in order to properly perform this mitzvah of Torah study. If a person does not understand what he's learning, you're not allowed to recite the blessing for Torah study, for Torah Shabbal Peh, if you don't understand what you're learning. Nevertheless, the toil of Torah still relates to going beyond logic and rationale. It is only when you approach Torah with this with a super rational approach, that is when you can properly toil in Torah. How is that accomplished? And this is in two ways. Aleph, der amal Torah darf sein merer wie es legt sich besichle. When you toil in Torah, there needs to be done a lot more than logic would dictate. If you're only going to study based on the amount that your logic dictates, it's never going to be considered amal, it's never going to be considered proper toil. Based, and the second approach is that amal b'Torah bringt him to the hanacha v'hasaga as eich the inyanim b'cher. Versteht ja besichlei. Properly toiling in Torah will help you realize that even the topics and the subjects in Torah that you do understand, that in emes and hecher from hasaga are really truly beyond your logical grasp. As the famous saying, the ultimate purpose of our knowledge of Torah is so that we do not know you. Implying that the deeper you get into Torah, the more you realize how much you don't know about Hashem and about Torah. Just as this is with Hashem himself, with God. The same is with God's wisdom, Torah. For Hashem and his wisdom are all one. So the more we delve into it, and the deeper we get into it, the more we realize how much we don't know. And that's the purpose of Amal Torah. So first of all, don't limit yourself to how deep you can go. And secondly, once you start delving into this deeply, you'll realize how much further you still need to go and how little and how much you don't know. As the Rambam writes, just like no creature, no human being can properly grasp his creator, he can also never properly grasp the creator's wisdom. As the verse says, as Eov says, God is concealed from the eyes of all living beings. A person who thinks he has reached and attained ultimate knowledge in Torah, that itself is an indication that you are lacking in proper toil of Torah. Just when you reach the point when you think that you've accomplished everything and you know so much and you've accomplished so much in Torah study, that itself is an indication that you have not even scratched the surface. As the previous Rebbe stated, even the most understood and the most logical parts of Torah should be treated like chukim, should be treated like super rational mitzvahs. This will now perfectly explain why the Torah uses the word bechukoisai in reference to Torah study. Again, bechukoisai represents engraving and reaching a level beyond rationale and logic. Even though this is referring to all areas of Torah, not only the types of mitzvahs that are super rational, also the other two categories of edus and mishpatim, even those two types of mitzvahs need to be approached through this amal Torah, through this toil of Torah, because through this toil in Torah, to the hakara, we attain the recognition as oich mishpatim zayin and chukim. Even the lowest level of mitzvahs, even mishpatim, the most logical and rational mitzvahs, are also chukim, are also observed because Hashem commanded us to do so, and not because of something that we understand in our own logic.